Did you know that at the apex of his glory, Alexander the Great ruled between 30 and 50 million people? That's anywhere from 15 to 25% of the world's population in the 4th century BC. Today we're going to discuss how Alexander ruled an empire this big, because contrary to popular opinion, he actually did care about the administrative details. And since this is the last installment of a 3-part series, we'll pick up right where we left off in India and recount Alexander's final years, as well as his ultimate legacy. So when we left off, Alexander the Great had won the battle of the Hydaspes River. He was planning further incursions into India. He ordered a massive fleet be built. He sent for reinforcements from back home, and then his troops mutinied. They were tired, they wanted to go home, and so Alexander did his usual trick of waiting 3 days and nights for a soldier to come and beg his forgiveness on behalf of the rest of the army, but this time nobody came, and Alexander's hands were tied, and he was forced to start the journey back to Babylon, the center of his empire. By this point, fresh reinforcements from Greece had arrived, about 36,000 infantry, as well as 25,000 sets of gold and silver inlaid armor, we are told. And also by this point, 1,000 ships had been built for that mighty fleet. Alexander put his childhood friend Nearchus in charge, and the fleet was manned by the various sea peoples of Alexander's empire, like the Phoenicians, the Carians, and the Egyptians, and others. Now, Alexander set off with this fleet to the intersection of the Hydaspes and Assinese rivers. The Assinese today is called the Chenab River, and on board Alexander's ship was the historian Aristobulus, who shared with Alexander his garbled account of the battle of the Hydaspes River. And Alexander is supposed to have taken Aristobulus' history, flung it into the river, and then threatened to do the same to Aristobulus. Clearly, even this master propagandist had his limits when it came to the fabrication of history. Now, when Alexander's fleet arrives at this intersection of the two rivers, a bunch of ships start crashing together, including Alexander's, and so he is forced to strip naked and jump into the river. And as well seasoned as Alexander was, as both traveler and warrior, he couldn't swim, and so he was only saved from drowning by his men, who dragged him to shore. After that, Alexander confronts a fierce Punjab tribe called the Mali, and he undertakes one of his signature nighttime desert crossings. He surprises them, he slaughters about 2,000 of them, and then proceeds to take a bunch of Mali towns. At one of these, Alexander grows so impatient that he scales up one of the ladders and then finds himself completely alone and surrounded by the enemy. He starts hurtling rocks at the enemy, and the sight of this so shames his troops, who had been holding back, that they start scaling the ladders as well and rush in to save their king. The only problem was that by the time they came to his salvation, Alexander had taken an arrow which punctured his lung. So this was one of the most serious injuries that he sustained throughout his life and career. And as the Mali are getting butchered by the infuriated Macedonians, Alexander is taken to the ship, and then he gets a Henry V tier surgical operation done on him. Henry V, the King of England, affectionately known as Hal, having taken an arrow to the left cheek during the Battle of Shrewsbury, and then getting that arrow removed. And similarly, Alexander gets the arrow from his lung removed. A physician known as Cratotomies is supposed to have done this procedure, but it may be that it was Alexander's general Perdiccas instead, because Alexander's men were obviously concerned about whether or not he would survive. Alexander is then supposed to have been taken through the camp on a stretcher and waved to his men, and then as a show of strength and vitality, even mounted a horse and caused many of the men to weep and rejoice. Alexander's inner circle are supposed to have been unhappy about this. Obviously, they were concerned about him risking his life further through this display of strength, but one of Alexander's veterans is supposed to have told him that brave deeds are what true men do, and the two are supposed to have struck up a friendship after that and remained friends until the death of Alexander. Alexander does 2 more things in India before he leaves. He founds another Alexandria, of course, at the intersection of the Hyphases and Indus rivers. He then sails down the Indus into the sea. He and his men see higher tides than they've ever seen before. The Mediterranean is a calm sea, so they were very surprised by the high tide here. And Alexander then embarks on a single ship into the open sea. And once he is out of sight of land, he no doubt believes that this is the ocean that wraps around the entire world. and he makes an offering to Poseidon. He drops a golden bull into the sea just as he had at the Hellespont. And with that, we arrive at one of the most dramatic, one of the most grueling, one of the most unnecessary episodes in Alexander's life, which is really saying something given what he and his men had been through up to this point. And the episode I'm referring to is the Gedrosian or Gedrosian Desert Journey. So even Arrian says that all the hardships his troops suffered in Asia, even taken together, do not deserve to be compared with the hardships of that march. And Alexander had several other options for getting back to Babylon. That's what makes this whole episode so unnecessary. He could have waited for the rest of his fleet to get built and then loaded the 50,000 men who would accompany him through the desert onto the fleet. He could have proceeded northwest through Kandahar, through the rest of Bactria, and then through Persia, just as Craterus and his detachment of men did. But instead, Alexander insists on taking 50,000 of his men through Gedrosia between India and Pakistan, the most inhospitable, the most gods-forsaken stretch of territory in the whole of the Persian Empire. So why did he do this? It has been speculated that it was punishment for the mutiny, but given the enormous cost to the Macedonian army, half of his men would end up dying after the desert crossing. Would Alexander have wanted this? Absolutely not. Yes, he had a complex relationship with the army. It was strained at this point, but would he willingly wish death on 25,000 of his men? Absolutely not. So he probably did this for two reasons. Number one, he wanted to link India and Persia and establish a trade route through the Gedrosian desert. And number two, probably more importantly, no one had done it. And this is what Alexander did. He was the first to do this, the first to do that. And so this was just his nature. He was going to attempt to do it. So the journey takes place during the late summer. It's supposed to be this sophisticated land-sea operation. Nearchus, in charge of the fleet, is supposed to accompany the army along the coast. The army is supposed to dig wells so that the navy has fresh water, and the navy is supposed to catch fish so that the army has food. Sounds good on paper. In reality, what ended up happening is that the fleet gets delayed due to unfavorable weather conditions, due to the wind. As you'll recall, the monsoon season had not yet ended, and then the army would get separated from the coast anyway because of uneven, hilly terrain. Therefore, both the army and the navy would have to fend for themselves. We'll get to the navy's fate later. For now, let's focus on what the army's crossing looked like. During the first phase, the army was sustained on rabbits, ginger grass, maybe some fish as well. They came across a people known as the fish eaters, and these fish eaters, they subsisted on fish, obviously. They were not tool makers, so they grew out their nails and used those as tools instead. And because the fish eaters were so poor, Alexander couldn't really plunder their belongings because they had none to really speak of. And so later the navy would come across them as well. Throughout the journey, Alexander and his men marched through the night to avoid the daytime heat, but pretty soon they ran out of water. They were forced to eat the pack animals, and whenever they came across an oasis, Alexander's men, not being able to contain themselves, rush these little bodies of water and inevitably get sick from overconsumption, start puking into the oases, and then ruining them for the rest of the men. Obviously, they couldn't drink from those oases at that point because they were filled with puke, and they would get sick from doing that. Alexander sends messengers on camels to go to the surrounding satrapies and ask for supplies, but mostly to no avail. And by the end of the 2-month journey, thousands are dead from heat exhaustion, from thirst, from simply giving up and being left behind. As I said, the total death toll ends up being 25,000 men, so about half of the army, and presumably all the camp followers following the army are also dead by the end of the journey. Arrian shares a pretty nice anecdote about Alexander, showing that even in the heat, Alexander had lost none of his showmanship. So quoting from Arrian now, some of the light armed troops who had turned away from the army in search of water found a shallow gully in which a little had pooled, a small scanty spring. Collecting the water easily, they went in haste to Alexander, as though bearing some great treasure. As they drew near him, they poured the water into a helmet and brought it to the king. Alexander received it and commended the men who had brought it, but took it and poured it out in the sight of all. And the entire army was so encouraged by this gesture that one would have guessed that everyone had drunk the water that Alexander had poured out. So obviously Alexander could have given this water to somebody dying from thirst, but Would that be as grand a gesture as this? Probably not, and he wanted everybody to see it. Alexander and his men finally reach the border town of Petra, and at this point, they have a considerably better and more well-watered journey during the final stretch to Persepolis, but they did still have another 500 miles. During that stretch of the journey, the Macedonians are throwing lots of parties. They're happy to be alive. They're happy that they have supplies around them and they could live off the land. And at one of these parties, we have one of the most conclusive pieces of evidence for Alexander's homosexuality, which is when he kisses the Persian eunuch Bagoas in sight of the entire army. Alexander rendezvous with Craterus, the one who had gone through Bactria at a place called Carmania. Craterus's journey through Bactria was a mountainous one, and so it wasn't the best terrain, but obviously it was much, much better than Gedrosia. And lo and behold, who turns up but Nearchus? And at first, Alexander thinks that only a small band of survivors made it, but it turns out that Nearchus had managed to bring most of the men back with him. The entire fleet, for the most part, survived. And so Alexander is supposed to have burst into tears at this. As I said, Nearchus and his men were delayed by the monsoon winds, so they spent an entire month on a tropical island subsisting off shellfish and mussels. They were so far away from this homeland at this point that they were able to see and map new constellations, and they also are supposed to have had a battle with a pod of whales, which apparently they came out victorious from. And despite their travails, Nearchus and his men were willing to sail the rest of the way from Carmania to Susa. At this point, Alexander visits Pasargadae. He goes there to visit the tomb of Cyrus one more time, and he finds it completely ransacked. He finds it empty of everything but the tomb and a royal couch, and he finds Cyrus's body discarded on the floor. And Alexander was obviously enraged about this. He demanded answers from the Magi who were responsible for the upkeep of the tomb. He tortures them for answers, but finds none. And then he charges Aristobulus, who was also an engineer besides his other talents. He charges him with restoring the tomb. By this point, Alexander, who had probably read Xenophon's book about Cyrus in his youth, had even more admiration for the founder of the Achaemenid Empire after having fought the Scythians. And from there, Alexander proceeds to vent all his frustrations from the setbacks and the disappointments of the last year on his satraps who had been misbehaving. So at Pasargadae, Alexander sacks the satrap Orxenes, who, besides failing to keep the tomb safe, had also called Bagoas, Alexander's boyfriend, a whore, and he then replaced him with the Macedonian Persian dressing Pusestus. At Susa, Alexander does more than sack the satrap. This satrap's name is Abuletus, and instead of sending supplies to Alexander's army in Gedrosia, he had sent coins, which was completely useless. So Alexander is supposed to have thrown these coins at his horses and demanded to know from Abuletus what good these would do. Alexander then executes Abuletus and personally dispatches with his son, apparently by plunging a spear into him. More generally, Alexander embarks on an anti-corruption campaign. So this mostly involves Persians. From this point onward, Alexander is supposed to have favored Macedonians as satraps, and a lot of the Persians that he had left behind as satraps ended up disappointing him. But a betrayal closer to home comes in the form of Alexander's incorrigible childhood friend Harpalus. He had already been forgiven once, and during Alexander's absence ended up splurging on Athenian courtesans and imported delicacies. So Alexander sacks him, and Harpalus ends up fleeing and then being murdered. Okay, so now that we've covered some of those reprisals against the satraps, it might be a good time to talk about the administration of the Macedonian Empire. So as I said at the outset of this video, Alexander ruled an empire with a population of 30 to 50 million people. 30 million is the conservative estimate frequently cited for the Macedonian Empire. The 50 million estimate is sort of an upper bound derived from the Achaemenid Empire at its peak in the 5th century BC. But I think it's a fair estimate because Alexander's empire was bigger than the Achaemenid Persian Empire. It included all of Greece. It also included parts of India that the Achaemenid Persians never truly subdued. And India throughout human history has been a very, very populous region. Now, an upper bound estimate for the entire global population in the 4th century BC is 200 million. So either way, this is pretty impressive. 15 to 25% of the population of Earth under one empire that of Alexander. Not only that, unlike in, say, China, this was a truly varied assortment of people. The empire included Greeks, Macedonians, Thracians, Lydians, Carians, Phrygians, Cappadocians, Syrians, Phoenicians, Jews, Arabs, Egyptians, Babylonians, Medes, Elamites, Parthians, Bactrians, Scythians, Indians, and more peoples besides. Alexander mostly kept the Achaemenid administrative structure in place, the system of satrapies or administrative districts. The whole empire was divided into 31 satrapies, 21 of which remained at Alexander's death. Two of those satrapies, Greater Cappadocia and Armenia, slipped from the empire quietly during the course of Alexander's life, and the rest were either abolished or absorbed to form larger satrapies. Notably, Egypt was not governed by a satrap, but two governors. Arrian calls them nomarchs, who ruled Upper and Lower Egypt respectively. And in contrast to what you might have heard about Alexander being a man of action, completely disinterested in peacetime affairs, disinterested in the governance of his empire, never having the makings of a varsity administrator, he actually appointed every satrap himself, and he was closely involved in the administration of his empire. He might have made a lot of mistakes in his appointments. He was the type to hire fast and fire fast, but he kept tabs on his satraps because of the influence they wielded, and he takes prompt action whenever he sees that there is a problem. He's constantly putting out fires when it came to the governance of his vast empire. Until the decisive Battle of Gaugamela, Alexander is appointing Macedonians and Greeks to be satraps. Only two native-born satraps were appointed before Gaugamela. But after that, he completely pivots and starts favoring native-born, especially Persian satraps. Then he pivots again after India, and the reason for this is that a lot of those Persian satrapal appointments ended up disappointing him for one reason or another. And so then he starts appointing Macedonians who could be trusted to be satraps once again. Satraps had various functionaries beneath them. This is where it already becomes a little bit unclear, the details of those functionaries, who they were, how standard this was. Scholars, including a principal source for this video, Philip Freeman, who wrote the biography of Alexander the Great that we've used throughout this video, scholars like him believe that Alexander was dividing responsibility to weaken some satraps, for example, in Lydia. But more recently, this has been contested on the grounds of, let's say in Lydia, simply the need to administer the province in an efficient way. Alexander wasn't trying to appoint functionaries in, let's say, Lydia to diminish the authority of the satrap so much as just let him do his job and make sure that the province is being governed correctly. Now, I just made a video where I divided a bunch of empires throughout human history from the Bronze Age to the modern era into 7 levels. And the working definition for empire in that video was one that had a clear core-periphery relationship where a dominant core would exploit the periphery. And it was basically a measure of empire to what extent a state could extract from the periphery to the core. And Alexander, despite ranking highly on that list, kind of defies this model because the center of the empire was wherever Alexander happened to be located. He was obviously always on the move, always mounting another conquest, pushing east until his troops mutinied and forced him to go back to the center of his empire in Babylon. But just as we hear of Napoleon, there is supposed to have been this constant stream of messengers flowing toward Alexander, giving him all the latest news and information about his satrapies, and then also going back and relaying news about his victories, which is what kept the empire together, and also making sure that Alexander's orders get carried out. But it's undeniable that this Alexandrine model of empire building had its issues. I mean, I already mentioned the 2 satrapies that quietly broke away from his empire, Greater Cappadocia and Armenia, and there were even other issues like liquidity. So this was a time where there were few financial instruments to speak of. A lot of payment was received in kind in the form of some goods, all of which had to be transported. But even with coins, which Alexander is supposed to have minted quite a lot of and seized a lot of, it's worth pausing for a moment to drive home how wealthy Alexander was at this point. By the time he was coming back from India, he had left Macedon bankrupt because of the cost of army maintenance, but he was now the wealthiest man in the world. For some perspective, the Delian League, which culminated in the Athenian Empire when it extracted tribute from the whole of the Greek world, aside from Sparta and her allies, that amount of tribute amounted to 600 talents per year flowing into Athens. And by comparison, Alexander is supposed to have gotten 300,000 to 400,000 talents after defeating the Persian Empire. He's supposed to have gotten that much from his conquests. So this was a truly stupendous amount of wealth. It's almost unimaginable. Just hearing those figures probably made a Macedonian feel like an ordinary person today hearing about the net worths of Jeff Bezos or Elon Musk. But the reason the troops continue to love and adore Alexander is because despite his personal habits, which were very Spartan, he didn't let this wealth get to his head and he didn't luxuriate in it. Despite that, he had a reputation for generosity. He would host games, feasts, bread and circuses. He was very good at that kind of thing. And he also did a fair bit of debt relief. So there was something of a Macedonian social safety net when it came to the army, which was by far the biggest drain on the treasury. It was army expenses. But despite all that, even with silver and gold coins, you did have to transport them. And so Alexander had liquidity issues when he was in faraway India. He would be writing to satrapies asking them to send money because he didn't have what he needed to keep his troops happy, which is probably what contributed to the mutiny, to be honest, and also to keep expanding his empire, right? He did make something of a splash in India and was able to win certain rulers to his side with gifts, but he probably didn't have as much as he needed, especially after having this massive fleet constructed. And so he did have liquidity issues in India, that is known. And this makes sense when you consider that transporting the treasuries of Pasargadae and Susa and Persepolis to Ecbatana, that took 3,000 camels and 20,000 mules. So this is a logistical operation. But by returning to his core, returning to Babylon and being much closer to Ecbatana, Alexander could more effectively administer his empire. And interestingly, it was the naked wise men of India, the Gymnosophiste, which was the Greek catch-all term for Jains, Hindus, Buddhists, who reminded Alexander of this fact. Alexander was always very into philosophy. He had studied under Aristotle. He obviously was an admirer of Diogenes, and he's supposed to have been very impressed by the naked wise men who stomped their feet on the ground to remind him that in death he would have nothing but the earth that possessed his bones. And one of these wise men was named Calanus. He's very reminiscent of Diogenes, right to living a little bit in an animalistic state and always taking his clothes off and that kind of thing. And so Alexander sent a cynic to go and meet with him. And supposedly Calanus would only speak to him once the cynic had taken off his clothes. And when this guru, this wise man, Calanus, finally meets with Alexander, and Alexander asks him how he should administer his empire, Calanus is supposed to have stretched an ox hide on the floor and then placed his weight on one edge of the ox hide, therefore tilting another up. And then he repeated this a few times before finally settling his weight down on the center, at which point the ox hide lay flat. And his point was that Alexander should rule from the center of his empire. Whether Alexander was ever going to do that is kind of an unanswerable question. We're going to talk about some of his secret plans, some of the conquests he might have been planning at the time of his death. But one thing is certain, and that is that Alexander was no dummy when it came to administration, and he was not completely disinterested. Here's what a modern scholar has to say on the topic of Alexander's administration. At the time of the king's death, his power over the entire empire looked rather stable, though not without reservations. Undoubtedly, if Alexander had not died then, he would have continued to perfect the organization of the administration of his empire. But as fate would have it, the process of state building was left unfinished by him. And so this is another point of view that flies in the face of what we usually hear, which is that Alexander's imperial contraption was unwieldy, that it could never have lasted, that it was always bound to fail and bound to be carved up. But the fact of the matter is that it might have lasted if circumstances had unfolded differently, if Alexander hadn't died so soon, if a successor from the Diadochi was able to emerge that had Alexander's charisma and competence, maybe Alexander's empire could have been reunited and maybe it could have lasted. Charlemagne's empire is an interesting analog. It obviously survived until the death of Louis the Pious, but after that was quickly carved up as per the Treaty of Verdun between Louis the Pious' sons. But even there, I think my takeaway from studying the Carolingian Empire in depth was that history could have unfolded differently there too. It's just that there were too many cooks in the kitchen. None of the Carolingians so outshone the others that they were able to recreate Charlemagne's successes, but it wasn't completely out of the question. But even if Alexander's empire did not last, the many cities he founded, the many Alexandrias did, as did all the coins he minted, which might have had an inflationary effect on some of those successor empires, particularly the Seleucid Empire. But the real engine of wealth creation was those cities. These were boom towns in a new Hellenistic world. They were a place where a Macedonian, a Greek could come, settle down, reinvent themselves, take up a trade, marry a camp follower, take a native wife, whatever. I love what one scholar had to say about this. While Alexander's conquest of the Persian Empire did not radically transform the economy of the Near East, for the Macedonians who followed him, he created a new world in which any of them could be king. So every man a king. Pretty great. Oh, and before I forget, Calanus or Calanus would end his days at 70, and he would do it by his own hand. He received lukewarm permission, let's say, from Alexander to burn himself alive, which he then proceeded to do before a crowd of astonished Macedonians. And he's supposed to have met his end with a genuine contempt for death, that is to say, bravely and stoically. At Susa, Alexander organizes the famous mass weddings. This has been seen as his attempt to create a new race of Greeks, Macedonians, and Persians, and more broadly, Europeans and Asians. More specifically, what ended up happening is that Alexander took two more brides. One was a daughter of Darius, one was a daughter of the previous king, Artaxerxes, and then he married another daughter of Darius off to Hephaestion. So this was a bro move, you know, homeboy as your kid's uncle. He wanted them all to be cousins. It makes sense. And the rest of Alexander's friends also got Persian brides. But after Alexander's death, all of these Persian wives would be renounced. So none of Alexander's inner circle really bought into this vision that Alexander had. He had a lot more success with the rank and file, who readily accepted Persian wives and wedding gifts and debt relief from Alexander. But when some of these soldiers returned home, they would leave behind their Persian wives and kids, actually at Alexander's order. Now, speaking of the rank and file, they were understandably upset at the arrival of the successors. This was the name of Alexander's Persian youth, let's say. These were 30,000 Persian boys trained in the Macedonian art of war, instructed in the Greek language. I mentioned them previously, and they were now trained. They were now ready for service. And so their arrival, combined with the simultaneous honorable discharge of some Macedonian grognards or old heads, led to the Opis mutiny. This mutiny almost spiraled out of control, but Alexander then rounded up and executed the 13 unlucky ringleaders, and then proceeded to give what was probably one of the greatest speeches of his life. And he basically spun the whole thing around on them and told them that they were betraying him and that they were abandoning him and leaving him to the mercy of the Persians, and that they should all just go back to Macedon. And he then did his usual trick of sulking off to his tent, giving the men the silent treatment for 3 days, when he wouldn't speak to any Macedonians, but he would speak to Persians. And after those 3 days were up, the Macedonians are begging for his forgiveness and making it clear that they want to stay by his side. And so the whole thing was a little bit of a misunderstanding, and Alexander ends up sending those grognards home, the ones that were too old to continue fighting. In the same stroke, he sends Craterus to replace Antipater, who, as you'll recall, had been instrumental to Alexander's accession as king of Macedon and had ruled as regent of Macedon ever since. The only problem with him is that he would frequently lock horns with Alexander's mother, Olympias, and so because of that, Antipater had to go. Craterus was supposed to replace him, but Antipater protested this, and he sent his son Cassander to talk things out with Alexander. But Cassander kind of screwed things up by, upon arriving to Alexander's court, laughing at a bunch of Persians who were performing proskynesis and bowing down to Alexander. And he had none of the context. He didn't know that somebody had lost his life over the whole proskynesis controversy. And so he was probably quite surprised when Alexander grabbed a bunch of his hair and then proceeded to smash his head against the wall. And Cassander, who was not a good guy for the rest of his life, is supposed to have almost fainted at the sight of Alexander's likeness after coming across a statue of him or whatever. But despite that, one day, Cassander would revenge himself on Alexander, even if posthumously, after Alexander's death. In the summer, Alexander proceeded to Ecbatana. It was there that Hephaestion got really sick, and he remained bedbound at a doctor's orders for a period of 7 days, at the end of which the doctor kind of slips up. He leaves Hephaestion's side and goes to watch a play. Hephaestion rushes out of bed, much as Alexander would. I guess they weren't so different, the two of them. And he proceeds to then wolf down a boiled chicken and wash it down with a bunch of wine and collapse on the floor. Alexander rushes to his side, but by the time he gets there, Hephaestion is dead. He is heartbroken. He crucifies the doctor responsible. He orders that no music be played throughout the city. He orders all the horses' manes and their hairy tails be shorn. He does the same to his own hair. He weeps at or even on the body of Hephaestion. He refuses to eat or drink anything. He holds lavish funerary games. He tries to get Hephaestion deified. He orders a massive tomb constructed. So it's safe to say that his grief was great and also very expensive, to the point that historians take note about the extent to which Alexander was going to lament his childhood friend. Hephaestion had kind of been Alexander's Agrippa. Of course, Alexander is one of the greatest military captains in history, if not the greatest. He didn't need an Agrippa to be winning his battles for him, but what I mean by that is simply that Hephaestion was a multi-talented guy who, besides being a trustworthy commander, was also an engineer. And he was effectively Alexander's second in command, I think it's safe to say. Alexander could trust him with his life. Hephaestion had even stood up to his mother Olympias at one point, because even she was jealous of how close Alexander and Hephaestion were. And given this history, given how histrionic Alexander's reaction was to Hephaestion's death, I think it's safe to say that this friendship went a little bit deeper and that there was a romantic element to it. Alexander is supposed to have dealt with his heartbreak the usual way by going off to war and subjugating a people known as the Caesians. At this time, he also received envoys from as far afield as Ethiopia, Iberia, Carthage, and even Rome. At the gates of Babylon, he is warned by the Chaldeans not to enter the city, at least not through the western entrance, because that is where the sun set. The Chaldeans knew that the other entrance was inconvenient, but Alexander is supposed to have gone in one way or another. But then the grim omens just continued. A raven fell dead at Alexander's feet. A lion was kicked to death by a donkey at the local zoo. Alexander's crown fell off while he was sailing. A sailor jumps in to retrieve it. In order to swim back, he has to put it on his head, and for this he is either flogged or decapitated. And just as brutally, some guy is found wearing Alexander's royal robes and crown and sitting on his throne unbidden, and for this he is executed. And what Alexander might have been trying to do with these two victims is make them a scapegoat for the god's wrath. It might have been clear to him at this point, if the stories are true, that he had displeased the gods, that they were out to get him, and so he might have been trying to make them happy with a human sacrifice. At least that is what some of the primary sources seem to indicate. But throughout all this time, Alexander was spending his days planning and his nights drinking. What was he planning? Well, a massive invasion into the Arabian heartland, for which he was preparing hundreds of ships. It probably is true that Alexander was out to conquer the world. He was just never going to stop. Besides the planned invasion of Arabia, he was planning to circumnavigate Africa. Of course, he had no way of knowing how long that journey would have been, but his intended destination was the Strait of Gibraltar, or the Pillars of Hercules, as the Romans would have called it, or Pillars of Heracles per the Greeks. He also planned a naval war against Carthage, as well as the conquest of southern Italy, Sicily, maybe even Rome. This might have been the Romans trying to write themselves into Alexander's legend. But you can't put that past Alexander either. He was crazy enough to try that as well. And he also wanted to finish what he started in Scythia and India. And he might have gone and done all these things had he been spending his nights a different way. But fact of the matter is that days before his death, he was holding a feast for Nearchus, partying, getting up early to do religious rites, then partying again by nightfall. And at the last party he would ever attend, he drinks a bunch of undiluted wine and collapses. He then gets a fever. He continues giving orders to his inner circle until he loses his ability to speak, at which point he gives his signet ring to Perdiccas. At last, he is asked who he was leaving his empire to, and as per Arrian, he says, to the strongest. And these were the last words of Alexander the Great. There's another Alexandrine death story that I just have to mention, that one involving his attempt to drown himself in the Euphrates. He was probably motivated by a desire to disappear without a trace as if he were some sort of divine being, but he was ultimately stopped by his pregnant first wife, Roxana. But let's address the elephant in the room. Was there foul play involved in Alexander's death? So it turns out there is some evidence to support this notion. We just talked about Antipater and his son Cassander. It turns out he had another son named Iolus, who was Alexander's cupbearer, so literally the guy in charge of making sure that Alexander wouldn't be poisoned. And it was none other than Iolus's lover Medius who invited Alexander to the same party where he collapsed. Apparently strychnine was used and smuggled in the hollowed hoof of a mule. And Aristotle might have been involved or at least known of the plot. He was nowhere near the scene of the crime, but he was a friend of Antipater. But let's also remember Alexander's many wounds and maladies. Plutarch lists these in a couple of places in one of his works. So he was wounded in the head with a stone by the Illyrians at the Battle of the Gernicus. He had his head gashed with a scimitar. At the Battle of Issus, he was run through the thigh with a sword or a spear. At the Siege of Gaza, he was shot in the ankle with a dart. He dislocated his shoulder. He had his shin bone split with an arrow. He was shot through the shoulder with an arrow as well. He also had his thigh wounded at Gandradae. And let's not forget the punctured lung fighting the Mali. He might have also suffered from malaria ever since he collapsed at the Cydnus River. And because of the rampant alcoholism, we can't rule out liver failure either. So all these things make the poisoning allegations a little bit less likely, although they don't conclusively disprove them. The ancient authors also entertain the possibility that Alexander was poisoned, but it's also been speculated that it could have been typhoid fever, since Alexander's symptoms are more consistent with that than poison. Whatever the case, there were of course great lamentations in the wake of Alexander's death. The Macedonians and the Persians alike mourned him. Darius's mother is even supposed to have starved herself to death, and then the Macedonian army passed between the separated halves of a dog as per an old Macedonian tradition. They did this after a meeting between Alexander's former inner circle, during which a ceasefire was agreed to, and Alexander's empire parceled out, essentially. So it was agreed that Alexander's mentally handicapped older brother, Aridaeus, would rule as Philip III. He would continue to rule until Roxana's son, if she did bear a son, would come of age. And already the factions were forming. Perdiccas was the favorite, Meleager was the infantry commander who had been raised up by recent events, and Ptolemy was Alexander's childhood friend, who also had a seat at the negotiation table. Antipater and Cassander held on to Macedon. A guy named Lysimachus ruled Thrace, and Seleucus ruled part of Asia. Eventually, Roxana did bear a son, and she proceeded to poison Alexander's other wives, conspiring with Perdiccas to do so. Perdiccas also assassinated Meleager, the infantry commander, but he was ultimately killed fighting Ptolemy in Egypt, not by Ptolemy, but as a result of a conspiracy that included Seleucus. Meanwhile, in Macedon, Cassander inherited the kingdom from his aging father Antipater, and he then assassinates Roxana and Alexander's son because they had come seeking refuge there. He double-crossed and assassinated Olympias, who died, we are told, as befitting Alexander's mother. To be clear, Olympias wasn't an angel, so this was somewhat deserved. You have to remember what she did to Philip's widow. She had just embarked on a killing spree against much of the Macedonian nobility, and she is even supposed to have executed Alexander's mentally handicapped older brother, Aridaeus, who had been ruling as Philip III, and forced his wife to commit suicide. Meanwhile, Alexander's concubine, the widow of Memnon of Rhodes, Barcine, fled to Pergamum, where she brought Hercules, her son, with Alexander. The two of them were poisoned, and Aristotle fled from an Athens gripped by anti-Macedonian sentiment in order to escape the fate of Socrates. The winners were Antigonus Monophthalmus, or One-Eyed, who established a kingdom in Asia Minor and got super fat. Seleucus, who established a vast empire, mostly corresponding to what had once belonged to the Achaemenids. He gave up all the hard-won Indian territory in return for 500 war elephants. Eventually, the Seleucid Empire would be swallowed up by the Romans and Parthians, but it lasted for a couple of centuries. But the real winner was Ptolemy, who established a dynasty that lasted until the death of Cleopatra, and during that span of time, completely eclipsed the Seleucid Empire. During that time, Alexandria thrived. It had a diverse population. It was a great hub of learning and science. It had the Library of Alexandria, of course, and also such impressive thinkers as Aristarchus of Samos, who advanced the theory of heliocentrism, and Eratosthenes of Cyrene, who gave the world a pretty accurate estimate for the circumference of the Earth. And you probably knew already about the success of Ptolemaic Egypt, but less commonly talked about is the Maurya Empire and just how Hellenistic it was. The Maurya Empire was the empire of Chandragupta and also his famous grandson Ashoka. They promoted the Greek language, they commissioned Greek art, there was a Buddha that was made on the model of Apollo, and there were various cities under their rule with all the trappings of Hellenic civilization. And eventually, Greco-Bactrian states were able to challenge Maurya rule and establish their independence. The most successful of these was probably the one that was ruled by Menander the Great, who was himself born near Kabul in modern-day Afghanistan. Let's wrap up by discussing the afterlife of Alexander for a little bit. Now, as I said at the beginning, the reason I did this three-part series on Alexander the Great is because his life makes for a good story. And it is such a good story, in fact, that his life has been told and retold endlessly throughout the generations since his death. As one historian wrote, "Around him the whole dream world of the East took shape and substance. Of him every old story of a divine world conqueror was told afresh. No other story in the world has spread like his." In the 3rd century, we get an amalgam of all the Alexander myths in the form of the Alexander Romance. This set of stories would spawn 100 translations and spin-offs in almost every language in Europe and the Middle East. In Latin, Aramaic, Hebrew, Arabic, Armenian, Sanskrit, Persian, and even Icelandic and the Middle English of Chaucer's age. Now, to be clear, the Alexander Romance lives up to its name as a romance. It has Alexander flying through the sky in a basket held by eagles. It has him deep sea diving, and it has him looking for the water of life. He, of course, appears in the Persian spin-off of the Alexander Romance, but also in the even more famous Persian work known as the Shahnameh, the Book of Kings. And in the Shahnameh, Alexander is reimagined as the Persian Prince Iskander, who, true to life, is the bane of the Persian Empire. For their part, the Zoroastrians never forgive Alexander for the burning of Persepolis. They call him Alexander the Accursed. And in Iran, up to the present day, it's safe to say that Alexander is not exactly a popular figure. But in Islam, more broadly speaking, he is referred to in the Quran as the two-horned one. This because of the coins depicting Alexander with horns, of course, a deific portrayal in the style of Zeus Ammon. And as for the Prophet Muhammad, he respected the Macedonians as he did the Romans. He spoke of Alexander as the philosopher king, whom God made mighty in the land and gave the means to achieve all things. Meanwhile, in Christianity, in the book of Daniel, it is written that there shall be a fourth kingdom on earth that shall be different from all other kingdoms. It shall devour the whole earth and trample it down and break it to pieces. And the book of Daniel has come up on the channel before. It is, of course, the reason for the Latin West's obsession with preserving and restoring the Roman Empire. Under this verse, there can be no other empire except for that of the Romans. It is the fourth kingdom, but the third kingdom is the Macedonian Empire of Alexander the Great. And in case you're wondering, the second one is Achaemenid Persia, and the first is Babylon. Now, much later in the course of Christianity, Dante places Alexander in the 7th circle of hell, which is a little bit ironic given that, as Philip Freeman writes, one could make a persuasive case that without the conquest of the Macedonian king, the Christian religion would have remained a local phenomenon. One thing that is constant is that Alexander's reputation and views on his legacy are going to remain inconstant. They are going to continue to be heatedly debated. There will be those like Philip Freeman who can't help but admire him, and those like Mary Beard who called him a drunken juvenile thug. Of course, both of these historians have nuanced views on Alexander, and they are capable of acknowledging the good and the bad. The ancient authors were no different, but in their case, they were probably even more willing to accept the brutality of Alexander's legacy, given that they lived in brutal times themselves. That is why Plutarch, for all his criticisms, was capable of coming up with a passage in one of his works where he talks about the great philosophers and how they could teach their dozens of pupils, but that Alexander, meanwhile, had instructed and improved entire peoples. Arrian, meanwhile, for his criticisms, ultimately concludes his account by saying that anyone who reproaches Alexander should not simply cite those deeds that deserve to be reproached. Instead, on collecting in one place all that concerns Alexander, let his critic then consider who he is and what sort of luck he has been favored with, that he proposes to reproach Alexander, given who the man became and the enormous success he attained, the undisputed king of both continents whose name reached every land, whereas he is a lesser man, toiling at trivial things and not even handling them with any ability. So what Arrian was saying was, who are you, who's anybody, to accuse Alexander of falling short, when we all basically fall short in front of this guy. As for how large Alexander looms in the popular imagination, that is the consequence of many different factors. It can depend on the debates of historians. It can also depend on what movies and books have most recently been written about him. It can depend on large-scale socioeconomic, geopolitical factors. In an age of empires, such as the Victorian Age or the Napoleonic era, Alexander is going to be popular. Today, at the end of history, in the age of liberal democracies, Alexander is supposed to be less popular, but is he really? I don't know. He's not as widely Googled as Caesar and Napoleon, let's say. That's something that we found out at the very beginning of this series. But if you were to ask people about Alexander the Great, I think most would probably say that, yeah, he was pretty great at what he did. As one scholar writes, for the obsessed CEO in the latter half of the 20th century, Alexander could become the idealized modern Wolf of Wall Street. And I think the same could be said of the 21st century. Ultimately, the jury is still out, though, as it will continue to be. With all that said, I hope you enjoyed this 3-part series. Thank you so much for watching if you made it this far. Another huge thanks to those supporting the channel as members or patrons, and I will see you all in the next video.